Hey everybody, and welcome to the very last review lesson for AP World History Modern Live. Now, when I say last review lesson, I don't mean last live stream ever. We still have one more week of live streams where we're going to practice doing the AP World History 2020 test. Next week, you're going to get 2 DBQs, one on Monday and one on Wednesday. And you're even going to be able to go to the AP or to the AP demo site and demo or practice submitting your DBQ in order to get a good idea of what the feel for the real AP test will be like. Then on Tuesday and Thursday, we're going to go over the AP World History, the DBQ from the day before, and what some good and bad examples would be, and some tips and tricks to do a good answer. And there's even a chance that we might have some special guests from the AP World History reading, people who read your essays and plan on reading your essays in order to score them so that you can get a College Board grade. Okay. Yesterday, Mr. Logereau gave you a DBQ. He gave you a 5-document DBQ with the prompt, evaluate the extent to which railroads affected the process of empire building in Afro-Eurasia between 1860 and 1918. This is a real DBQ that AP World History students have been asked to do in the past. So, Mr. Logereau challenged you to come up with some ideas for context and to come up with some ideas for outside evidence in order to help earn points on this DBQ. Here's some potential bad answers for context. Railroads were a part of the Industrial Revolution. While this is a true fact, it does not provide context because context has to be more than just a fact. It has to be a fact, a big picture, broad historical pattern that is connected to the ideas of the prompt. And by merely mentioning railroads were a part of the Industrial Revolution, you may have started your statement about context, but you have to connect that to the idea of the prompt and bring it in to the more specific or granular concept of empire building. Another example is European powers held a series of conferences in the late 19th century to diffuse tensions between them and avert war. Again, a true fact, but what is its relevance? It does speak to empire building, but it speaks in no way to the concept of railroads and the idea that railroads might have an effect on the process of empire building. Neither of these would be good ideas for context. However, here are some possible answers that you could use that are good ways to earn context. Railroads played an important role in the Industrial Revolution because they provided a faster and more efficient method of overland transport than had ever existed before. Notice I've underlined the part here that's bringing in the connection to empire building. It gives an allusion to the idea that it's connecting long distances and that goods or people can be moved across long distances. This brings context because it's connecting the idea of the Industrial Revolution directly to the prompt. Here's another example. The Industrial Revolution aided Europeans in the creation of large empires by linking places together at a cheaper cost. You can see the same concept here. The Industrial Revolution still is a concept that you can use to bring in for context, but it doesn't stand alone as context. It must be drawn in to the concept of the prompt. In this case, by talking about the use of industrial technologies for creating large empires. Okay, let's take a minute and look at outside evidence. Like the European powers, Japan developed an extensive railway network in Korea to facilitate its imperial control. This is an example of evidence beyond the documents because this gives you an idea of how railroads affected empire building. In this case, the Japanese built their empire through the use of railroads in Korea. Western transnational companies advocated for the creation of railroads in Latin America because it suited their economic interests, much as it did in Afro-Eurasia. Again, this is an example of how maybe a topic sentence that says something along the lines of railroads helped increase the imperial economy by connecting long distances or by increasing the efficiency of transporting goods and people or raw materials and manufactured goods. And this further provides evidence for that by demonstrating a time and a place where railroads played a role in empire building, in this case, through increasing economic profit. All right, let's move on and talk about what we're going to focus on for the rest of the day. If you don't know me by now, well, I'm Chad Smith. I'm from MacArthur High School in Irving, Texas. I'm representing my Texas M today for our very last review lesson, showing off a little bit here. So let's dig in. I'm going to give you two documents and just a little bit of time to read each document. And I want to know, what are the causes of long distance migration in the period 1750 to 1900? So you're looking in this document for what caused long distance migration. Okay. So hopefully you came up with some ideas here, and hopefully the main idea that you came up with is the fact that indentured servants or people who are moving from one people to another, laborers, are recruited by companies, and especially in this case by governments. It says here they're not people who are going for their own needs. They're not slaves that are taken. Instead, they're slowly recruited with a lot of work, like someone might be recruited into the military service. Let's take another look at one more document. Okay, let's take a look at this document. Hopefully, as you were reading through this, you were catching on to the idea of migration for the purpose of labor and the extraordinary economic demand for products, agricultural products, such as sugar. Along with the process of sugar came cotton and tobacco and other important cash crops. But this increasing demand for agricultural production led to an increasing demand for cheap and free labor. Not to mention that this is happening as European countries are ending at first the African Atlantic slave trade, and then even eventually Atlantic slavery as a whole, as they're ending the concept of, or as they're ending the slavery, they're seeking out new sources of cheap or even free labor. And so one common reality was migration from parts of the world into these regions. In this case, into the British colony of Mauritius in order to participate in sugar cane production. All right. So pretty straightforward today. We're going to try to look at the causes and consequences of long distance migration in the period 1750 to 1900. But I want to take a minute and point out that we spent the last few days talking about imperialism, and today we're talking about migration. And these ideas, these concepts are grouped together in Unit 6. But Unit 6 is not called imperialism and migration. It's called consequences of industrialization. That's important for us to understand, that this type of migration only exists because of the industrial process. The industrial process led to an extraordinary increase of demands for consumer goods all around the world. And this demand for consumer goods led to a massive increase for raw materials that could be manufactured into such consumer goods. This meant that laborers were needed in order to increase production and therefore increase manufacturing so that there are more consumer goods. That happened because of industrialization. Further, industrialization made it possible because of the fact that the technologies, the transportation-based technologies, made regular long-distance migration of hundreds of thousands of people possible. If they were still traveling by sail through the Indian Ocean and hadn't connected different parts of the world, they wouldn't be able to actually go about the process of long distance migrations in the way that they do during the period 1750 to 1900. So there's lots of different causes and consequences of long distance migration, but it's important to understand it in the, ready? In the context of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is what makes this entire lesson and the two lessons that we've done over the last 2 days possible. Both imperialism and migration only operate in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And the way that the Industrial Revolution strengthened the technology and economies of European and the United States of America and even Japan in order to allow for expansion and the labor needs that led to migration. So let's move into our lesson. I already mentioned that throughout the 1800s, first Britain began to abolish and work to abolish for other countries the Atlantic slave trade. But also throughout the 1800s, most of the Americas, all of the Americas actually ended slavery in their states in general through the process known as abolition. You can see in this picture here on your right, a popular slogan or logo or phrase that was used as a part of the British abolition movement. In the Americas, you can see that throughout the 1800s, every state, even you can still tell what's happening, even though this is a map in French, it's still pretty easy to recognize the name of the states, and also the numbers happen to be the same. So I still put this map, this French map in here, even though I personally don't speak French. But you can look at this and you can see the timeline of American states in the Americas actually eliminating slavery. Of course, the three last states were the United States of America in 1865, Cuba in 1886, and Brazil in 1888. This reality, the end of slavery in these states, led to companies and plantation owners and farm owners to look for a new source of labor. And unsurprisingly, they wanted a new source of labor without having new expenditures, meaning they didn't want to spend a lot of their money on this new source of labor. So with slavery being illegal, they looked for ways to create systems that were similar or just as cheap as slavery. So there are several different types of indentured oh my gosh, there are several different types of labor migration as a result of this need for labor. One of the most commonly recognized type is indentured servitude. When indentured servitude takes place, usually people had from a lot of times from Asia and sometimes from Africa, people had contracts that lasted a certain amount of time, 7 years, maybe 10 years, and they would get free travel to wherever it was that they were going to do the work. Then they would work for nearly free and very little compensation in terms of food and shelter for the term of their contract, and then they were supposed to return home. Although they usually had to pay their own way to get home, which made that a bit of a dubious part of the contract. Oftentimes, indentured servants stayed much longer than they were contracted to stay, and they made homes in the new places, in their new homes, and began to build societies there. Another type of labor migration included imperial recruitment, where Indians, for example, were forced by the British imperial government to leave parts of India and move into other parts. For example, we just read about the sugar colonies in an island off the coast of Southeast Africa. they might be forced to move to that very island in order to work in a sugar plantation there. So imperial recruitment was very similar to indentured servitude, except for you were within one empire, and it was the colonial government moving people from one section to another section. Oh, sorry. One other major type of labor migration included penal colonies. The most famous example of a penal colony is the British colony of Australia, although the French also had penal colonies in Africa. As a part of their settler colony that the British had started in Australia, they often sent prisoners and debtors in order to do large amounts of difficult labor. The penal colony, the practice of sending prisoners to Australia lasted for a while, but ultimately, even despite the labor conditions that many people experienced in Australia, as they chose to stay after their time had been served, it was decided that such a punishment wasn't much of a punishment at all. Here's some important examples of where different people in large numbers moved in these major migration patterns. For example, Indian laborers moved to British colonies in the Caribbean, in both South and East Africa, and in the Pacific Island Ocean of Fiji. In the Pacific Ocean Island. You know what? You can tell I haven't really spoken a lot today, can't you? Okay. Chinese laborers moved to lots of different places. Two of the most commonly recognized places are California in the United States of America, and to the British colony of Malaya in order to work on railroads and farms. And Japanese laborers moved to sugar plantations in Hawaii, Peru, and Cuba. There's lots of different reasons to leave home, but most of the time those reasons were economic and involved the idea that there was more opportunity. As bad as it seemed to have to work on a farm or to be in the indentured servant labor conditions, seemed certainly much better than the conditions where they were. In India, one of the common reasons that people left was extreme poverty under British rule, poverty that led to great famine across India. In China, there were problems such as overpopulation and a need to move population in order to decrease density, and also disorder that was brought about by the Taiping Rebellion. Ireland famously had a massive famine in the 1800s, and as a result, thousands of Irish people left Ireland and moved to primarily the United States. But another factor forced them away from Ireland, which included political dissent against Britain. Britain began to take action against Ireland, including dissolving its parliament in the early 1800s. And so this caused many Irish people to leave Ireland as well. But it's important to note that migration wasn't always about labor. There were other examples of non-labor migrants. For example, British technical engineers moved to different parts of the British Empire and settled in different parts of the British Empire in order to help develop infrastructure and other important engineering needs. As a matter of fact, so many British engineers left Britain into other parts of the British Empire that it was almost like what they call an engineered diaspora, or the idea of the science also that moved along with people and spread along into these different parts of the British Empire. Another common idea of non-labor migrants included British trying to set up a settler colony in Argentina. Though Britain didn't establish a full-blown settler colony in Argentina, and Argentina was only part of the British Empire, but not actually colonized by the British Empire, many bankers and financiers went to be a part of the British settler colony in Argentina. Japan actually attempted to create a settler colony of its own in Mexico. And while they played a major role in the Mexican economy there and Mexican agriculture, they failed to establish a full-blown settler colony. Another example of non-labor migrants is students going to study the culture and and not just study math and science, but also to study the culture and bring back both social, cultural, and political ideas. One of the most famous examples of this is Japanese students who traveled to the United States in order to participate in studies. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read this document. And I'm not giving you very much direction with reading this document, but so I just want you to kind of take some notes and think about it, and also think about not just what were the motivating factors, which we already looked at, but I want you to think in this document, who is migrating? So I want you to look over the motivating factors for migration, which is reviewing what we've just discussed. And I also want you to ask yourself the question, who is migrating? I'll give you about 90 seconds or so. Okay, so when you read this article, or when you read this document, you can see that the author clearly was struggling economically back in China, and somebody who had returned from America and laboring in America, explained the opportunity that existed back in America. And so the economic opportunity, and especially in the context of the economic difficulties in China, is clearly a motivating factor here. But the other question I asked you to consider is who is doing the migrating. And in this case, there's an example of 6 young men who leave China in order to go to America. So that's a really important factor, because one of the realities of migration and massive amounts of migration pattern, we're talking about migration in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, from places like China and India into new places. One of the realities is most of the migrants were men. Most of the people who went on these migration journeys were males. And what that meant was that there were demographic changes in societies back home. Oftentimes, those demographic changes meant that there was new responsibilities and roles for women in society. And as men were leaving, women were able to step into those new roles and responsibilities. There's other major effects of migration as well. One of the realities of migration is that when people migrated from one place to another, they often stayed together in their new, what the College Board refers to as receiving societies. These receiving societies, for example, we talked about the United States, or we talked about islands in the Caribbean. In these receiving societies, migrants often created what were called ethnic enclaves. If you're into the TV show Arrested Development, ethnic enclaves are famously parodied in the town of Wee Britain, where a whole lot of British people live in the middle of California. So this picture here demonstrates a common ethnic enclave in Houston, Texas. In Houston, Texas, where obviously Chinese people have taken root and created their own ethnic enclave. You can see in this picture that what we would think of as normal street signs in the United States of America have on top of them added the street signs also in Mandarin Chinese, because most of the people who live in the region spoke Mandarin Chinese. There's lots of examples of ethnic enclaves throughout the world. You can see in this picture the largest example of a Chinese enclave, which is found in San Francisco, California. As a result of gold mining and many Chinese people migrated to the United States and not only stayed in California in order to participate in the gold rush, but traveled in order to help because they were a major source of labor for the Transcontinental Railroad. Other examples of ethnic enclaves included the Chinese people in Peru and Cuba, Indians enclaves in South Africa. Of course, most famously, one of the most famous people who lived in an Indian enclave in South Africa was who we talked about at very beginning of our online lessons when even before we started the review. We were learning back in unit 8 and 9, we learned about a man named Mohandas Gandhi as a part of the decolonization movement. And before he actually began working in the 1900s as a part of the Indian National Congress, he lived in South Africa and worked on behalf of Indians who were discriminated against in South Africa in Indian enclaves. Other examples include Indians in Southeast Asia. In large parts of Southeast Asia, after the end of indentured servitude, they adopted a system called, I'm going to try it, Kangani. The Kangani system actually allowed for the recruitment of entire families, and this helped actually keep the not just ethnic enclaves, but keep more whole and complete Indian customs and traditions and societies. One more famous example of ethnic enclaves was Italians moving into Argentina, where Argentina was famously had a very, very immigrant welcoming policy for its government. One final important effect for us to understand about immigration is that receiving societies weren't always welcoming towards immigrants. As a matter of fact, other than cheap labor, most receiving societies saw little value in immigrants. One of the most famous examples of this is in California. The California Constitution, when it was written, actually stated that Chinese people could not earn citizenship unless they could be proven white. And the United States government eventually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to limit the number of Chinese people who could immigrate to the United States. Australia was also extremely discriminatory and prejudiced against Chinese immigrants. Famously, Australian miners took up arms and began to actually attack and even publicly execute Chinese immigrants who were working in Australian mines. This led to the Australian government creating the Influx of Chinese Restriction Act, which actually tried to create taxes for Chinese people immigrating into Australia. And eventually, throughout the 1900s, the idea of the White Australia policy, which promoted white culture and the concept that Australian citizens and Australian workers should be white and not Chinese. All right. I know we went pretty fast today, but even though this is an important unit and for us to understand, there's lots of examples for you to look up and get more information about. So here's some things that you may want to look up and get some more information about. These are examples of voluntary migrant patterns, from where people went to where they went and why they migrated. I don't want to read it to you, so I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds to go over this. A lot of what we already said here, we've discussed already in this lesson. Of course, I'll take a moment to note that I've adapted this chart out of the 2020 AP World History Modern AMSCO book by Perfection Learning. This chart looks very similar, but it's actually extremely different. It's still charting out migration patterns, but this is giving us an example of forced migration, where the migrants had little to no choice in their own movements. So again, I'll give you a few seconds to look over this, and a lot of it is a review of what we already discussed in today's lesson. All right. Finally, let's take one quick review of some of the major effects of immigration. I'll give you about 25 to 30 seconds to try and figure out what you think the 3 bubbles are that would go to this bubble graph. All right, here's what we came up with based off our lesson today. One major effect of immigration took place in home countries where many migrants were leaving to go somewhere else. This was because so many of the migrants were male. As a result, roles and responsibilities for women in these home countries changed. Another example is the development of ethnic enclaves, where similar ethnic people grouped together and created societies of their own, where they celebrated their own cultures, ate their own foods, made their own clothes and products, and oftentimes isolated themselves from other parts of from other communities. However, it also led to diffusion and even fusion of cultures sometime. One famous example is in Peru. Many Peruvian food items involve Chinese food heritage as well. Finally, our last effect of immigration is the prejudice, discrimination, and even state regulations against immigrations in what the College Board refers to as receiving societies, the places where many of these immigrations wound up living as a part of their migrant pattern. All right. So let's take a final look at our very last homework assignment of 2020 AP live streams. Whoa, just kidding. No homework today. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. We're not going to give you guys a homework assignment today. However, I want to remind everybody that next week on Monday, we want you not sleeping and dreaming about working, but actually working. 5 o'clock Central Time, right here on your AP Live stream, we're going to proctor an AP World History DBQ and try our best to give you an experience that will be like the AP World History test, where you will get an example, an opportunity to look at 5 documents with a prompt, to have a timer on the screen, and to even go to the AP demo site and submit and practice submitting your assignments. Then on Tuesday and Thursday, we will spend that time reviewing the respective DBQs from the day before. And we're even going to try to bring in special guests who are other AP World History readers who have over the last several years had the opportunity to grade and score your essays, and will also be doing so this year in order to give you some good tips and tricks in order to make sure you're ready for the AP World History test. All right, thanks everybody so much for watching. We're really looking forward to next week. We think it's going to be a special opportunity. So please make sure you come back on Monday at 5 o'clock and join us every day next week for our very last week of AP live streams. Bye, everybody.